One signature. That's all it took to unleash the most devastating economic chaos in Portuguese history. Maria I, Portugal's first queen regnant, ruled with wisdom and devotion for years. But one decision made in a moment of weakness, influenced by ambitious advisors and her own unshakable faith, transformed a prosperous kingdom into a state on the brink of bankruptcy. What began as an act of piety ended up costing her not only the economy, but also her sanity. Before we continue with this story of power, betrayal, and irreversible consequences, please subscribe to our channel. Hit the like button if you're interested in real stories of European royalty, and leave us a comment. Did you know this story of the Portuguese monarchy? Your support allows us to keep bringing these incredible stories. Now, let's return to the year 1777, when a pious woman ascended to the throne without knowing that her greatest virtue would become her curse. Lisbon, February 1777. The bells of the Sé Cathedral rang out, announcing the beginning of a new era. Maria Francisca Isabel Josefa Antonia Gertrudes Rita Joana de Bragança had just been proclaimed Queen of Portugal and the Algarves, becoming the first woman to rule the kingdom in her own right, not as consort or regent. At 42 years old, Maria I was a paradoxical figure. Deeply religious to the point of attending Mass 3 times a day, yet also a woman educated in Enlightenment ideals. She had been prepared to govern since childhood, studying politics, economics, languages, and philosophy with the best tutors in Europe. Her father, José I, had trusted her in a way few monarchs trusted their daughters. "Your Majesty, the kingdom awaits you," announced her prime minister, the Marquis of Pombal, the powerful man who had rebuilt Lisbon after the devastating 1755 earthquake. Maria looked at him with a mixture of respect and wariness. Pombal had been her father's right hand, almost a dictator in everything but name. He had modernized Portugal, expelled the Jesuits, strengthened the economy, and centralized power, but he had also accumulated enemies by the dozen. "Marquis," Maria said in a firm voice, "your services to Portugal have been invaluable, but times change, and with them, so too must the methods of government." The tension in the throne room was palpable. Everyone knew what was coming. "Your Majesty," Pombal began, his voice still controlled but with a hint of unease, "if I may suggest that continuity in these times of transition is—" "The Marquis of Pombal is hereby relieved of his duties as Prime Minister, effective immediately," Maria declared, and a murmur of surprise rippled through the court like a wave. It was her first major decision as queen, and many applauded it. Pombal had been brutal in his methods, had imprisoned without trial, had executed entire noble families under suspicion of conspiracy, but he had also been effective, terrifyingly effective. Maria I had a different vision for Portugal. She wanted a kingdom governed by Christian compassion as much as by enlightened reason. She wanted to restore certain privileges that Pombal had eliminated, return confiscated lands, release political prisoners, and above all, she wanted to repair the relationship with the Catholic Church, particularly with the Jesuits her father had expelled. "Justice without mercy is tyranny," she told her advisors, "and faith without reason is fanaticism. Portugal must find balance." Her first years of reign were, for the most part, successful. She established educational reforms, supported the arts and sciences, and Portugal enjoyed relative prosperity. She ruled alongside her husband and uncle, Pedro III, a gentleman who preferred music and architecture to politics, leaving important decisions in Maria's hands. But there were voices whispering in the shadows of the court. Nobles who had lost power under Pombal saw in the new queen an opportunity to recover their former positions. Clergy who had been marginalized for decades now found receptive ears in a devout monarch. And ambitious financiers saw in the queen's generosity an open door for their own schemes. Among the latter was the Count of Belmonte, a charismatic aristocrat with connections in both Lisbon and the Vatican.
Tall, soft-spoken, with an easy smile, he had captivated the queen with his apparent piety and his grandiose plans to restore Portugal's spiritual glory. "Your Majesty," he told her one afternoon in the gardens of Queluz Palace, "Portugal was once the armed wing of Christendom. We brought the faith to Brazil, to Africa, to Asia. But now, after decades of secularizing policies, we have lost our spiritual way." Maria, who had always felt guilt over the crown's wealth while so many suffered, listened attentively. "What do you propose, Count?" "An investment in the kingdom's salvation, Your Majesty. Restore Jesuit missions, rebuild destroyed churches, establish hospitals and schools administered by religious orders. But all of this requires significant funds." "The treasury funds are designated for the state's needs," intervened the Viscount of Villanueva da Cervera, the new prime minister and Maria's trusted man. "And what need is greater than the salvation of our people's souls?" countered Belmonte. Maria fell thoughtful. Her faith was genuine and deep. She truly believed that Portugal's problems had as much a spiritual dimension as a material one, and the idea of being remembered as the queen who returned Portugal to God's grace was seductive. What Maria didn't know was that the Count of Belmonte wasn't acting alone. Behind him was a network of financiers, impoverished nobles, and unscrupulous merchants who saw in the pious projects an opportunity for massive enrichment. Contracts to build churches would be inflated, funds for missions would disappear into private pockets, and donations for charity would line the purses of intermediaries. The trap was being set, and Maria, with all her education and intelligence, couldn't see it because she was blinded by the one thing that mattered most to her, her faith. One evening, as she knelt in her private chapel, Maria prayed for guidance. "Lord, show me how to serve you and my people. Let my reign be one of righteousness and mercy." She didn't know that God's answer would come through the very people who sought to manipulate her devotion. The Count of Belmonte presented his first formal proposal 3 months into her reign, the Royal Edict for the Spiritual Restoration of Portugal. It called for the allocation of 2 million crusades, nearly a quarter of the annual royal budget, to religious projects over the next 5 years. The Viscount of Villanueva da Cervera was alarmed. "Your Majesty, this sum is astronomical. It would deplete our reserves and force us to increase taxes significantly." "The people will understand that this is for their eternal benefit," Belmonte interjected smoothly. "And besides, the economic benefits of a spiritually renewed population cannot be underestimated. A pious people are a productive people." Maria was torn. Her rational mind, trained in economics, saw the danger, but her heart, devoted to God, saw an opportunity to do something truly meaningful. "I need time to consider this," she said finally. But time was precisely what Belmonte and his associates couldn't afford to give her. They needed her to act quickly, before wiser counsel could prevail. That night, Maria's confessor, Father Bernardo, unknown to her a close friend of Belmonte, visited her chambers. "Your Majesty, may I speak freely?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. "Of course, Father. I have been praying about the Count's proposal, and I believe God has shown me a vision. Portugal stands at a crossroads. One path leads to continued prosperity, but spiritual decay. The other may be harder, may require sacrifice, but leads to divine favor and eternal glory." Maria's eyes widened. "You believe this is God's will?" "I believe, Your Majesty, that sometimes God calls us to make difficult choices that the world will not understand. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son. Are you willing to sacrifice temporary wealth for eternal salvation?" The manipulation was masterful, and Maria, despite all her intelligence, fell for it because it spoke to her deepest values and fears. The next morning, she signed the edict, and with that single signature, the economic destruction of Portugal began.
The first year following the signing of the royal edict seemed to vindicate Maria's decision. Churches rose across the countryside, Jesuit missionaries returned to Portuguese territories, and the Queen was praised from pulpits throughout the land as Maria the Pious and the new Isabella of Portugal. But in the halls of the treasury, a different story was unfolding. "The numbers don't add up," whispered João Rodrigues de Sá Amenezes, the royal treasurer, to the Viscount of Villanova da Cerveira. They stood in a small office, ledgers spread before them, candles burning low as midnight approached. "What do you mean?" the Viscount asked, though he feared he already knew. "The cathedral in Coimbra, the contract states 50,000 cruzados for construction. I've been to the site. The materials being used, the labor being employed, the actual cost should be no more than 20,000. Where is the other 30,000 going?" The Viscount's face darkened. "And the others? Every single project is the same. Inflated costs, phantom workers, materials that don't exist except on paper. Your Excellency, we're not funding spiritual renewal. We're funding the greatest theft in Portuguese history." They had discovered the truth, but proving it to the Queen would be nearly impossible. Belmonte had been careful. The actual contractors were legitimate. The churches were being built. The missions were being funded. But at every level there were kickbacks, bribes, and skimmed percentages flowing back to Belmonte and his network. When the Viscount finally gathered enough evidence to present to Maria, she was devastated. "This cannot be true," she said, her voice barely a whisper as she read through the documents. "The Count is a man of God. He wouldn't—" "Your Majesty, men of God are still men, and men can be corrupted by greed." But Maria wasn't ready to believe it, to accept that she had been manipulated, that her faith had been used as a weapon against her kingdom, was too painful. "These are just numbers," she said, her hands trembling as she set the documents aside. "Perhaps there are legitimate explanations, higher costs than anticipated, difficulties in procurement." "Your Majesty, please," the Viscount pleaded. "We must halt the projects immediately, conduct a full investigation." "And what message would that send?" Maria's voice rose, defensive and afraid. "That the Queen lacks faith? That she turns back on her commitment to God at the first sign of difficulty? No, we will continue as planned." It was her second great mistake, and it would prove even more costly than the first. As the months passed, the economic situation worsened. To fund the continuing religious projects, Maria had to raise taxes. The Portuguese people, initially supportive of their pious queen, began to grumble. Trade decreased as merchants found it harder to maintain profits. The nobility, seeing their own wealth threatened, began to turn against the crown. And then, in the spring of 1779, disaster struck. A severe drought hit Portugal, devastating crops across the kingdom. Normally, the royal treasury would have provided relief, purchasing grain from abroad and distributing it to prevent famine, but the treasury was depleted. The funds that should have been available for emergencies had been poured into Belmonte's projects. "We have no choice," the Viscount told Maria grimly. "We must borrow from foreign banks or let the people starve." "Then we borrow," Maria said, though her voice lacked conviction. Portugal took its first international loan at crushing interest rates. The kingdom that had once been a creditor to half of Europe was now in debt to London and Amsterdam bankers. Maria began to change. The confident, intelligent woman who had taken the throne was being replaced by someone anxious and fearful. She attended Mass not 3 but 5 times a day. She spent hours in confession, seeking absolution for sins she couldn't even name. "Your Majesty, you look pale," her lady-in-waiting, Dona Mariana, observed one morning. "Are you eating?" "How can I eat when my people starve? How can I sleep when I may have led them into ruin?" Her husband, Pedro III, tried to comfort her. "You acted with the best intentions, my love. No one can fault you for that." "The road to hell is paved with good intentions," Maria replied bitterly, quoting a proverb that had taken on terrifying new meaning for her. Meanwhile, Belmonte had disappeared. As evidence of his fraud became impossible to ignore, he had quietly fled to Rome,
taking with him a fortune estimated at over 800,000 cruzados, money that had been meant for God's work. When Maria learned of his escape, something inside her broke. "I was a fool," she told the Viscount, tears streaming down her face, "an arrogant, stupid fool who thought she could serve God and the kingdom simultaneously, without wisdom to discern between true faith and manipulation." The psychological toll was immense. Maria began to have nightmares, visions of starving children, of burning cities, of herself standing before God's judgment throne, with the souls of her people crying out for justice. By 1880, Portugal was in full economic crisis. Inflation soared, unemployment rose, trade with Brazil, the crown's most valuable colony, decreased as colonial administrators lost faith in Lisbon's ability to govern. There were bread riots in Porto and protests in Lisbon, and through it all, Maria sank deeper into depression and guilt. "Your Majesty must make a public statement," her advisers urged. "The people need to hear from their queen." When Maria finally appeared before her court, those who saw her were shocked. She had aged a decade and 3 years. Her hair had gone gray, her face was gaunt, and her eyes held a haunted quality that was disturbing to witness. "I have failed you," she said simply, her voice barely a whisper as she read through the documents. "I thought I was serving God, but I was serving my own vanity. I thought I was saving souls, but I endangered bodies. I am not fit to rule." The court was stunned into silence. "Your Majesty, you cannot abdicate," the Viscount said urgently. "The kingdom needs stability, needs leadership." "Then let me provide it," came the voice from the back of the hall. Everyone turned to see João, Prince of Brazil, Maria's eldest son, stepping forward. At 22, he was young but capable, and he had watched her mother's descent with growing concern. "Mother," he said gently, kneeling before her, "you have carried this burden alone for too long. Let me help you. Let us rule together until you are well again." Maria looked at her son, and for the first time in months, hope flickered in her eyes. But it was a false hope, because the worst was yet to come.
The year 1784 brought an unexpected catastrophe that would shatter what remained of Maria's fragile mental state. Her husband and uncle, Pedro III, died suddenly of a fever in May. For Maria, it wasn't just the loss of a spouse, it was the loss of her anchor, the one person who had supported her unconditionally through the nightmare of the previous years. "He's gone because of me," Maria told her confessor through uncontrollable sobs. "God is punishing me. First the kingdom, now this." "Your Majesty, the king died of natural causes. This is not divine punishment." "Isn't it?" Maria's laugh was bitter and broken. "I have brought ruin to Portugal. My vanity, my pride, and my own faith, these sins have consequences, and Pedro has paid the price for my failures." Her son João watched helplessly as his mother spiraled. He had taken on more governmental responsibilities, effectively acting as co-regent, but he couldn't heal his mother's psychological wounds. Then came the revelation that pushed Maria past the point of no return. In August 1784, a former member of Belmonte's network, dying of consumption and seeking to clear his conscience, sent a detailed confession to the palace. In it, he described the full extent of the conspiracy, how Belmonte had specifically targeted Maria because of her known piety, how Father Bernardo had been paid to manipulate her through confession, how every aspect of the scheme had been designed to exploit her greatest virtue. "They studied you, Your Majesty," the Viscount read from the document, his voice shaking. "They knew your schedule, your habits, your devotions. They crafted their approach specifically to bypass your considerable intelligence and appeal directly to your faith." Maria listened in silence, her face pale as death. "The man Belmonte," the confession continued, "often joked in private that the more intelligent the mark, the easier to fool them, because they never suspect they could be outwitted. He said you were the perfect target, smart enough to execute the plan once convinced, but too devout to question its spiritual justification.
Something in Maria shattered irreparably at those words. She stood abruptly, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Your Majesty?" the Viscount called out in alarm. Maria walked to the window overlooking Lisbon, the city she had failed. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. "It's not that I was fooled. It's not even that I destroyed the economy. It's that I thought I was being virtuous. I was so proud of my faith, so certain of my righteousness. And that pride, that certainty, it killed my kingdom." "Mother, please." João approached her carefully. "You were deceived by criminals. You acted in good faith." "Good faith built on pride and vanity. Do you know what I pray for now, my son? I pray that I was simply stupid, because if I was merely stupid, then at least I wasn't sinful. But I know the truth. I was proud, and pride is the deadliest sin." From that day forward, Maria I of Portugal began her final descent into madness. She refused to leave her chambers. She wore only black. She insisted that she was damned, that God had abandoned her, that she could hear the screams of the damned calling her name. Her hair, already gray, turned completely white. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating regularly, and spent up to 18 hours a day in prayer, not the serene prayer of the devout, but the frantic, desperate prayer of someone trying to bargain with an angry God. "The fires are coming," she would tell anyone who would listen. "I can feel them. The fires of hell are waiting for me. I can hear the souls of my people screaming. They're burning because of me." Doctors were consulted, treatments were attempted, bloodletting, purges, herbal remedies, even early forms of what would later be called psychiatry. Nothing worked. Maria was trapped in her own mind, reliving her mistakes in an endless loop of guilt and terror. By 1786, it was clear that Maria could no longer rule, even nominally. João was officially made Prince Regent, though his mother retained the title of Queen. She was moved to Queluz's palace, where she could be cared for away from the demands of court. But even in her madness, Maria's torment served a purpose. It became a rallying point for reform. João, having witnessed the devastating consequences of his mother's mistake, implemented sweeping changes. He audited every government contract, prosecuted corrupt officials who could be found, and instituted transparency measures that would prevent such fraud in the future. He also faced the harsh reality of Portugal's economic situation. The kingdom was broke. The loans taken out were coming due, and there was no way to pay them without severe measures. "We must restructure the debt," his advisors told him, "negotiate with the foreign banks, extend the payment periods, reduce the interest rates. And if they refuse, then Portugal faces bankruptcy and possibly foreign intervention." The negotiations were brutal. British and Dutch bankers, smelling blood in the water, demanded concessions, trading rights in Brazil, naval bases in the Azores. Portugal's humiliation was complete. The once mighty maritime empire was now at the mercy of foreign creditors. João signed the agreements with a heavy heart, knowing his mother's single mistake had reduced Portugal to a debtor state. But there was one final twist in the tragic tale. In 1788, Father Bernardo, the confessor who had manipulated Maria, was discovered living in a monastery in Spain. He was extradited to Portugal and put on trial. The trial was public, and thousands attended to see the man who had helped destroy their kingdom. When asked why he had done it, Father Bernardo's answer was chilling in its simplicity. "I was offered 50,000 cruzados and a position as bishop. I am a man of God, yes, but I am also a man, and men have weaknesses." He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but before being taken away, he asked to make a statement. "I wish to say something to Her Majesty, Queen Maria, if she can hear me. Your Majesty, you were not wrong to have faith. You were not wrong to want to serve God. You were only wrong in trusting me. I was the sinner, not you. Your virtue was real. My exploitation of it was the crime." Whether Maria ever heard these words is unknown. By 1788, she was so deep in her madness that she rarely recognized even her own children. But the statement raised an interesting question.
Who was truly at fault? The virtuous queen who was deceived, or the deceivers who exploited virtue? Maria I of Portugal lived for another 28 years after losing her sanity, though lived is perhaps too generous a word. She existed, a ghost in royal garments, haunting the corridors of Portugal's palace, occasionally screaming about fires and damnation, other times catatonic and unresponsive. Her son João ruled in her name, first as Prince Regent and eventually as João VI after her death in 1816. He proved to be a capable, if cautious, ruler who never forgot the lesson his mother's tragedy had taught him. Even the best intentions can lead to disaster without wisdom and vigilance. João implemented reforms that slowly rebuilt Portugal's economy. He renegotiated the debt agreements, developed new trade relationships, and instituted financial oversight mechanisms that made another Belmonte-style fraud nearly impossible. It took 20 years, but Portugal eventually recovered its economic stability. But the cost had been enormous. Portugal had lost its position as a major European power. While Britain, France, and Spain expanded and industrialized, Portugal stagnated. The sick man of Western Europe, some called it, a has-been empire living on past glories. And through it all, Maria lived on, a constant reminder of how a single mistake could echo through generations. Visitors to Portugal'S sometimes reported hearing her in her apartments, singing hymns in a cracked, wavering voice, or reciting prayers in Latin. Other times, she would have moments of lucidity, asking for her husband Pedro, forgetting he had been dead for decades. "Is the kingdom well?" she asked her son during one of these rare lucid moments in 1810. João, by then a middle-aged man worn down by years of regency, looked at his elderly mother and considered lying, but he'd learned the value of truth. "It is recovering, mother, slowly but recovering." Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I destroyed it, didn't I? My pride destroyed everything." "You were deceived," João said gently, "and yes, you made mistakes, but you also taught us valuable lessons. Because of what happened to you, we've built safeguards that will protect Portugal for generations." "At what cost?" Maria whispered. "At what terrible cost?" João had no answer for that. Historians have debated Maria I's legacy for over 2 centuries. Some see her as a tragic figure, an intelligent, well-meaning queen undone by the exploitation of her deepest values. Others view her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and the importance of separating church and state. Still others argue that she was simply incompetent, that any capable ruler would have seen through Belmonte's scheme. But perhaps the most interesting interpretations come from modern economic historians who've studied the Belmonte fraud in detail. They point out that what happened to Maria I wasn't unique. It was an early version of schemes that would be repeated throughout history. The Mississippi bubble, the South Sea bubble, the Wall Street crash, the 2008 financial crisis, all involved trusted figures exploiting the confidence of those in power to enrich themselves while destroying broader economic systems. Maria I's mistake, wrote historian Dr. Antonio Mendez in his 2019 book, The Pious Queen, wasn't in having faith, it was in failing to maintain healthy skepticism alongside that faith. She created an either-or in her mind. Either you trust completely or you lack faith. She never understood that prudence and faith could coexist. The churches and missions that were built with the embezzled funds still stand today, ironic monuments to a scheme that nearly destroyed a kingdom. Some are beautiful, architectural marvels that visitors visit without knowing the dark story of their construction. Others are more modest, serving communities that have used them for over 2 centuries. In a strange way, some good did come from Maria's mistake, though at a cost far too high to ever justify it. The scandal led to sweeping reforms in how Portugal managed public funds. It accelerated the separation of church and state that Pombal had begun, and it created a cultural skepticism of corruption that, while not eliminating the problem, at least made it harder for such schemes to succeed in the future. When Maria I finally died on March 20, 1816, at the age of 81, the entire kingdom mourned, not for the mad old woman she had become, but for the intelligent, devoted queen she had once been. Her funeral was attended by thousands, and João wept openly at the loss of the mother he had known only briefly before madness claimed her. She was buried in the Basilica of the Estrela in Lisbon, a church that, ironically, she herself had commissioned to be built, one of the few religious projects from her reign that had been completed honestly and without corruption. Her epitaph, chosen by João, read simply, "Maria I, Queen of Portugal. She loved God and her people. May God grant her the peace she could not find in life." But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Maria I isn't in stone or bronze. It's in the systems and safeguards that her tragedy inspired. Every financial oversight committee, every transparency law, every check and balance in Portuguese government all carry a trace of the lesson her suffering taught. In the National Archive of Portugal, researchers can still find the original Royal Edict for Spiritual Restoration, the document Maria signed with such hope and faith in 1777. The signature is clear, confident, the handwriting of someone certain of their righteousness. Next to it, in a different folder, is a letter she wrote to João in one of her last lucid moments in 1812. The handwriting is shaky, barely legible, the words of someone broken by guilt and regret. "My dear son," it reads, "learn from my mistakes what I could not learn until too late, that faith without wisdom is foolishness, that charity without discernment is waste, and that even the best intentions, if acted upon blindly, can lead to hell. I thought I was serving God. Instead, I nearly destroyed his people. May you rule with both heart and head, with both faith and reason. May you be the king I failed to be as queen. Your loving mother, who prays daily for your wisdom and Portugal's forgiveness." This letter has become required reading for Portuguese students of history and economics, a reminder that leaders, no matter how intelligent, how well-intentioned, how devoted, must never stop questioning, never stop verifying, never assume that their good intentions are enough. Maria I made one mistake, just one. She trusted the wrong people for the right reasons, and that single mistake cost her kingdom 20 years of prosperity, cost her people immeasurable suffering, and cost her own mind its peace. Her story asks us a question that remains relevant today. In a world full of those who would exploit our virtues for their gain, how do we maintain faith while developing discernment? How do we trust while remaining vigilant? How do we lead with heart while thinking with our heads? Maria never found the answer, but in her failure she left us a roadmap of what not to do, a painful, tragic, ultimately valuable lesson written in the ruins of a kingdom's economy and a broken queen's sanity. And perhaps that, in the end, is her true legacy, not what she built, but what she taught through what she destroyed. A lesson carved not in stone, but in sorrow, not in triumph, but in tragedy. The queen who made one mistake, and the kingdom that paid the price. If this story impacted you, please share it. Subscribe for more untold stories of history's most fascinating figures. And in the comments, tell us, what do you think is Maria I's true legacy? Her mistake or the lessons it taught? Your perspective matters, and we want to hear it.